Insights into Jesus is our conference theme. His words in his language, Hebrew. His wisdom in his culture, Jewish. His world in his land, the land of Israel. One gospel of Jesus Christ. This is our theme for the evening. The pastoral relevance of who wrote the first version of the gospel. Who cares? I could have cared less at seminary. I could have cared less about the map of Israel too, some black dots with Bethlehem, Hebron, Jerusalem. And here historical geography is my bread and butter, and this is my love. First, I want to deal with the academic problem, then with the pastoral consequences. What is the academic problem called the synoptic problem? It's the unusual combination of similarities and differences between our first three Gospels. So, who has problems with that? Well, conservative traditional Bible scholars are often disturbed over the differences between the Gospels. And some try to explain the differences away. Some even try to create harmonies of the Gospels, where they'll try to put all four of them together in one, hopefully, harmonious account where everything fits. But who else has problems? Liberal modernist Bible scholars have problems. They're often disturbed over the similarities between the Gospels, and some try to explain the similarities away. Some even throw out all the miraculous elements and leave only a core of ethical teachings and try to make do even without Jesus. So please note, we're going on a safari into the academic jungle. We're going to need to use the language of the jungle, the technical jargon of the jungle. And there's a warning. The following facts are not dangerous, but how they are interpreted can be either detrimental or upbuilding of a biblical faith. Use and abuse of facts. The following facts that I'm going to get into shortly have been interpreted in such a way as to undermine the faith of thousands of young men and women at our seminaries. But they can also serve to undermine doubters. I'm assuming that most of us are believers who don't really need what I'm about to say this evening except to help our friends who are doubters. And we can undermine their doubts with some of the facts about the Synoptic Gospels. And that's a certain pastoral relevance. But the following facts can also be used to strengthen and encourage the faith of these students and our own. This also is a pastoral relevance. And so this evening I want to talk about facts, theories, consequences of the abuse of Markan priority, and then fourthly, results of the research and theory developed in the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Gospel Research. And here I'm doing what was done earlier at this conference, giving you the facts. And you may need to fasten your seatbelts because we're going to move too fast to grasp. It's just to get an inkling. And we're going to look first at the differences between how the Gospels begin. Because here's the prologue to Luke's Gospel. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events, the pragmaton, that's the same word that Luke uses in his second book, the Acts of the Apostles. His first book is not titled a gospel by himself. He titles it the Acts of Jesus. So that's where he's coming from. Many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events, so we know by inspired scriptures that there's a lot of accounts out there already before Luke starts writing. Just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account, to write in sequence to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So in Hebrew that would be Ma'aseh Yeshua, the acts of Jesus. Now, Mark's gospel actually calls it a gospel. He's been traveling with Paul, who even speaks of the gospel of God, the good news of God's faithfulness to his people, which is so big that it's too big just for that one chosen people. We're to be grafted in, and so it's for all nations. The gospel of God's faithfulness. And Mark has traveled with Paul until Paul got disgusted with him. More about that later. And so he says the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. That's how he starts. Matthew doesn't call his work a gospel. He says, I'm giving an account, a biblos, a book, of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, and then he launches into all the begats, which Luke doesn't deal with until the 3rd chapter, and Mark doesn't have at all. And if we look at John, this high-flown theological, philosophical, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him not anything was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of the world. So very different beginnings, and we call them all Gospels. And if we take a look here at Matthew and at Luke, that's where you have infancy narratives, stories about, in Matthew, of the wise men following a star, and in Luke of shepherds out in the field hearing angels. And none of that exists in Mark. And then if you go to the end, appearances of the risen Lord, you have them in Matthew and in Luke, and in the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark, but in one of the oldest documents that doesn't have that longer end, you just end with the empty tomb. So another curious difference between Mark and the other two is not just that he starts with John the Baptist and doesn't have the early stories and doesn't have the post-resurrection appearances. He's the fastest gospel, and here's what I mean. Robert Morgenthaler has a book where he lists every word and then how often it occurs in the scriptures, in the New Testament. And here's a Greek word ethous, which means immediately. It occurs once in Luke, 42 times in Mark, and only 7 times in Matthew. So Mark jumps in at John the Baptist and speeds through. That's the one that people usually memorize if they want to give a dramatic reading, by memorization. And it's fascinating if you've ever been to one of those sessions where an actor just simply stands on the stage and recites the whole Gospel of Mark from beginning to end. You have a 5-minute break in the middle, and then in a couple hours you've gone through the whole Gospel of Mark. And he's fast, he's dramatic in the way he tells the story. So let's look at some further facts, complex facts, very complex facts, maybe even too much for the world's greatest geniuses, which is what I think is part of why we've got the synoptic problem. So you can't just say, well, I got this figured out and put it on the shelf. Everybody is still applying their minds, and nobody has got it all sorted out. So which writer tells which stories? We're going to look at each one of the Gospels and see what percentage is a story that he tells by himself, or with the other two, or with just one of the other two, so that Here's the Gospel of Luke. What's in white, almost half of the Gospel is words relating to stories that the other two don't have at all. And what's in red, about a third of his Gospel, both of the other two have those stories. And what's in green here, 20% is shared with Matthew alone. And a tiny bit, a couple percent shared with Mark alone. When we come to Mark, almost 3/4 of his Gospel is material that's in the other two Gospels. And about a fifth is shared with Matthew alone, tiny bit shared with Luke alone, and very little independent material, not in the others. When we come to Matthew, about a third is independent material the other two don't have, about a third is shared with the other two, and then the remaining third is shared either with Luke or with Matthew. And so here's looking at each gospel as a whole, not relating to the fact that they're very different lengths, a diagram of how Mark has about 2/3 of his gospel, even more, that is made up of material shared by the other two. But if we look at actual word counts of what is the amount of words used in shared material, here's a peculiar fact. As we look at all three, as we look at Matthew and Luke, Matthew and Mark, Mark and Luke, and the independent material, how many words they spend in telling those stories. Mark is the longest gospel in terms of wordiness of what he, yes, does tell. That reminds us of Jewish Targumists who will sometimes take a story and retell it and dramatize it. So here's another way of seeing how Mark, in the material that is shared, is the most wordy of the Gospels. The longest gospel in terms of material that he actually uses. Then let's look at the order of the story units of that material that is shared only by Matthew and Luke. And look at that. 62 story units, and only the first 5 are in the same order, and the other are all out of order. Now Luke says, I want to write an orderly account, so he must have really reordered, or somebody he was using reordered the order that Matthew had. So there's rather striking differences in how they decided to put the stories. And Luke has that material in about 8 chapters, Luke 10 through 17. And in Matthew, it's grouped differently in different places in his gospel. So here's the way they order the stories in relationship to each other. But then there are some similarities. If we look at the stories shared by all three, down this central column of Mark, this is the work of Robert Morgenthaler, a Swiss who loved to count. He's got about 128 little lines down the center column. That's how he divides up the Gospel of Mark. And 90 of them are shared by Matthew and by Luke. And you can see that most of them are located in the same place in the Gospels. But a few, with those diagonal lines, are located in different places in the different Gospels. So that's rather impressive. But if you look a little more closely at these impressive similarities, there are differences. Out of the 90, there are only 57 that are in the same general sequence. And of them, one writer, at least, has changed the order, since 33 of the overall 90 units are not in the same order. And if we look at how many of them agree on exactly the same sequence, same immediate sequence of one after the other, there are only 39 of the 90, which means that one writer at least has inserted material between the units, since 18 of the 57 units are not in the identical sequence. So now, those are facts. There's no theory there at all. That's just counting. Theories attempts to explain the differences and the similarities. Well, the old classic way is they must have been copying from each other to some extent. Interdependence. And the first one to come up with a theory on this was Augustine in the 4th century. Luke is the last. He copied from Matthew and Mark, and that looks like this. And that stuck for centuries until Johannes Griesbach in the 1700s and the 18th century did a parallel column of the Gospels, parallel columns of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in Greek. So you could actually look very carefully and look at the differences. And he came up with this theory that Mark is the last. He was the abbreviator. And he copied from Matthew and Luke, and that diagram would look like this. But the theory that rules the vast majority of seminaries and Bible schools in the world today, to the extent that they look at this at all, is this one, that Mark is the first gospel, and Matthew and Luke copied from him, but Matthew and Luke have so much common material, they must have had some other source, and it's just called the source. In German, Quelle, so it's abbreviated with Q, and you get Matthew and Luke copying from Mark, but also from some other Quelle, some other source. So that's the dominant theory. And that's what Lindsay was taught, that's what I was taught. But here's a German scholar, Etta Linnemann, who was a student of Bultmann and used to teach the higher criticism that would shred the Gospels to little bits. And she's now written a book, Is There a Synoptic Problem? Rethinking the literary dependence of the first three Gospels. And she says what is called the synoptic problem has never been impartially investigated. There's always been some agenda. It can't be proven. In fact, the synoptic problem doesn't exist. Here's a high critical German scholar. The Holy Spirit got a hold of her, and she went from one extreme to the other. She just believes that all four of them wrote by themselves, and if there are any similarities or differences, that's the problem of the Holy Spirit and has nothing to do with one of them copying from the other. And she left Germany, and she's teaching in Batu, Indonesia at a Bible Institute. Now, if you've got to go to one of the extremes, I would go with her. The Holy Spirit knew what he was doing in choosing to give 4 records about Jesus and leave it at that. Well, I do think that she went from one extreme to another. But let's just see what happened so that I can give you some student testimonies as to what actually happens under the influence of, like the Jesus seminar where they take votes, did Jesus really say it or didn't he, and they have just barely a few left that he maybe really did say. I was standing on the Mount of Olives, rerun, Mount of Beatitudes, overlooking the Sea of Galilee, had a group of theology students from Emory University. And I read from the beginning and the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And when I finished, one of the students said, "This is it. Christianity is the greatest religion. There's nothing like it in the world. These high, marvelous, moral, ethical principles, nothing can compare. You know, it really doesn't matter if Jesus ever lived or not. We've got the greatest religion, the high morality of the Sermon on the Mount." And you knew right there he'd never try to live it. I love what Capernwray Bible School teaches in Northern England. Nobody lives the Christian life. It's a little bit weird for a Christian Bible school. One exception, Jesus, and you can invite him into your heart and start living the Christian life. Because Jesus takes the intention, of the last of the 10 Commandments. Don't even want what belongs to somebody else, and he applies that all across the board. Now go and live that without the Holy Spirit in you. Or, to my shame, because my background is Lutheran, I was teaching historical geography of the Bible at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. I showed some pictures about the Sea of Galilee area, Jesus' ministries, and one of the students comes up to me afterwards and says, "To listen to you talk, you make it sound as if Jesus really said those things in those places. But we know better than that. The New Testament is 2nd and 3rd generation former pagan, Greek-speaking Christians doing the best they can to write up what they thought about Jesus. And we can hardly know what Jesus actually said. And they're supposed to go out and preach sin and salvation." So this isn't just irrelevant academic issues. This is what's happening because of what's being taught at some of our seminaries. Or Flusser was giving a lecture in Germany, and he told me about this. One of the professors who heard him came up to him and said to him in agitated German, "You have strengthened the hands of the primitive integralists." Well, what's a primitive integralist? Somebody who, when they read the New Testament, is so primitive as to think that what it says and what Jesus really said are the same. That there's an integrity between the two. And he was angry because Flusser had strengthened people who actually believed that Jesus said what the New Testament says he said. And Flusser used to say, some of your liberal Protestant theologians make it sound as if Matthew, Mark, and Luke were great theologians and Jesus was nothing. All excited about the theology of this one or the theology of that one, instead of just realizing it's different styles, different concerns. It's more than a problem, it's a tragedy, and it's caused by not knowing his Hebrew words, his Jewish wisdom, his land of Israel. In fact, one of the students had come up to him in Europe and said, Dr. Flusser, Professor Flusser, there are actually, according to Bultmann, only a few sayings of Jesus that we can really be sure. And so Flusser, in excitement, said, well, what are they? He said, I don't remember which ones. It's not just a problem, it's a tragedy. So we've looked at some of the facts, we've looked at some of the theories and the devastating consequences. Let's take a look at how in the world that could happen by the abuse of Markan priority. This theory, there are godly Christians at conservative seminaries who believe that this is the way it happened. But this theory has been abused. Started in the 18th century when there was a major attack against the credibility of the Gospels as historical witnesses. And especially the infancy narratives, the stories about Jesus' birth, were being ridiculed. So what's your solution? Well, take a look at the Gospels. There are no infancy narratives in Mark, and there are no post-resurrection appearances. So, solution, drop the beginning and end of Matthew and Luke with their stories about wise men falling stars and shepherds seeing angels. And stick with Mark. You've got something historically reliable in Mark. But notice what's going on here. A process of erosion has begun. Gospel reliability is being called into doubt. And doesn't stop there. Because the attack was not just on the infancy narratives, but on the supernatural in general. So, what's your next solution? Eliminate the miracle stories. Problem, Mark has miracle stories. Drop Mark. The next stage, what's left? Well, all that's left are the teaching stories in Matthew and Luke. And so these wonderful ethical teachings that you can pick and sort out of the stories in the Q material, this hypothetical document. Then they thought they got support, for this Jesus is a nice man. There's a book, Jesus the Marginal Jew, Jesus the Galilean Peasant, the ethics teacher. And then that one student who thought Jesus isn't even necessary, you have the ethics without him. And they thought they got additional support with the discovery of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, which basically has teachings. Well, that's from centuries after the time of Jesus. It's in the Coptic language in Egypt. It's a translation from Greek long after the four Gospels are canonical Gospels. But they're so desperate to get rid of the supernatural that they're going to use the teachings in Matthew and Luke and the Gospel of Thomas, or nowadays, here in Israel even, just a few months ago, we had Gospel of Judas. So you've got Thomas the doubter and Judas the traitor, and these are your sources for the ethics of Jesus. So is there anything to it? Depends on who you ask. And we've already done this, looked at the seminary students and their testimonies, their reaction to the Sermon on the Mount as only being ethics, to photographs of the Sea of Galilee, ridiculing the notion that Jesus really said those things at those places. Flusser standing up for Jesus more than Protestant theologians in Europe. We've looked at this with only a few authentic sayings left and not even so sure about them. So why are the students coming up with these things that I meet as I teach in this country and abroad? Because of what many of the seminary professors are teaching them. Christianity is nothing but ethics, a high moral code, Jesus the nice man. Now the fourth part of this evening's talk, Jerusalem School of Synoptic Gospel Research. The Hebrew factor enters the scene. Entering this confusing scene, two men, Lindsay, an American who is a Baptist pastor, Flusser, a Czechoslovakian Jew who is a classical philologist. Flusser, as a philologist of classical Greek literature, has immigrated to Israel. He wants to read everything written in Greek by Jews, and so he reads the New Testament, which not a whole lot of Jews would do. And he had the fortune, from our point of view, of living in a place, I think it was the Moravian Brethren who were positive about the Jewish people. And so he didn't have this usual tremendous prejudice against Christians because of the way Christians have been dealing with Jews in Europe. And there was an openness so that he wasn't embarrassed about reading what the Jews wrote in the New Testament. And he sensed the Hebraic character of the Greek in Luke's gospel. Because remember, he's a Greek specialist, so he can feel these things. Lindsay, desiring to provide a Hebrew New Testament for the Hebrew-speaking members in his congregation, starts to translate Mark, because we've all been taught that Mark is the first gospel. It's the shortest in the overall length. It's the longest in terms of material shared with the other two Gospels. And he starts to translate Mark, and he is baffled because Mark is erratic. Sometimes it's easy to translate to Hebrew, and there's kind of a funny Greek, and other times it's smooth Greek, and it's hard to translate into Hebrew. And then he's surprised to find out that in Luke, sometimes whole paragraphs go smoothly into Hebrew. And he had the uncanny feeling it's sounding more like I'm getting at the words of Jesus in this translation than in the Greek that I'm reading. Then he found out that Matthew is also easy to translate to Hebrew. But here's a weird one, unless Mark has the same story. So he came up with a theory that Mark must be responsible for this change in Matthew. Because when Mark tells the story, and Mark is erratic, sometimes improved Greek, sometimes this Hebraic Greek, Matthew follows step. And so he felt that our Greek Matthew is looking at our Greek Mark. But Luke is independent. Whether the others have the story or not doesn't affect how easy it is or hard it is to translate Luke from Greek into Hebrew. He's unaffected by the wording of Mark or Matthew. It's easy to translate whether they have the story or not. And so here's a basic grid. That there was an early Hebrew account. And that is coming out of looking at the Greek of the Gospels. It's not coming because he had studied church history or because he had any axe to grind in terms of synoptic theories. He's a pastor who wants to translate for the Hebrew-speaking members of his translation and sees these funny things going on. and senses there's got to be a Hebrew story. Well, then after the fact, he notices that Eusebius, the 4th century church father from Caesarea, quotes a 2nd century church father, Papias, who says Matthew wrote the story of Jesus in dialecto Hebraidi, in the Hebrew dialect, in the Hebrew language, and others translated it as best as they could. And so here's this Hebrew biography of Jesus, a rather literalistic Greek translation, which all 3 of our Gospels use. Hebrew Matthew is the first translated rather literalistically into Greek, and used this Greek translation used by the other writers. With Luke having this very Hebraic Greek, Mark dramatizing, dropping the central 8 chapters, Luke 10 through 17, but lengthening the materials that he does have, dramatizing, speeding it up, and immediately he did this, and immediately he did that. And then Matthew coming along and respecting the story order and the wording of Mark, but putting back in a lot of the materials that Mark dropped out. And that's why there's such a body of Matthean, Lucan agreements of material that Mark doesn't have. Now, enter Raymond Martin. He wrote Syntax Criticism of the Synoptic Gospels after doing his doctoral work at Princeton. And he has 17 criteria for checking a Greek document to tell if it's a translation from Hebrew or not. And of course he used the Septuagint, because you know that that's a Greek translation of a Hebrew document. Then he looked at tens of thousands of lines of pure Greek by the Greek authors that have nothing to do with the biblical world, nothing to do with relation to Jews, classical Greek writers, and found out certain details that I won't go into here that will help you determine whether you're reading Greek or translationese Hebrew Greek. And here's what kind of a chart he came up with. Let's just take a look here at Luke. When Luke is writing material that he has that the others don't have, the higher on this scale is more Hebraic, the lower more Greek. He's got very Hebraic materials. When he writes the second part of Acts, as we heard earlier today, it's pure Greek with no Semitisms at all. So if the same author who knows how to write, when he says, we, Paul and I did this and that, a pure Greek with no Hebrew influence at all, is got a very Hebraic Greek in his special materials in the gospel, that should tell us something, that he is faithfully taking over some of this material that he said was out there before he started writing. It's not the way he writes Greek. So where's he getting it? He's taking it over. And because of that literal type of translation is preserving for us Hebrew idiom. And that's what makes him easy to translate into Hebrew. Then if we look at triple tradition, in Luke, highly Hebraic. Mark has improved the Greek so much that it's very less Hebraic, and Matthew is correcting back to a more Hebraic Greek. So this was a doctoral dissertation that resulted in several books by Raymond Martin. So here we're back to the scheme of the Jerusalem School. So please meet Luke, a faithful copyist who uses the Hebraic Greek, even though he knows to write smooth Greek in the book of Acts. Mark, the dramatizer, who improves the Greek, but he will have the same sentence as Luke, identical, but two of the words will be flipped. You can't stand to say it the same way. Or he'll have two sentences that are the same as Luke, but he'll flip the order of the sentences. Or sometimes he'll have the same paragraph as Luke, but he'll flip the order of the paragraphs. Mark is the Eugene Peterson of the gospel writers. You know the message? He knows you've heard it a certain way, And he is deliberately saying it in a different way in order to be dramatic, to shock you. Wait a minute, wake up. You know, you've been reading this, you're used to it, but you need to pay attention to what's written here. And so you use Eugene Peterson to kind of shock you and wake you up and say, wow, is that what it says? And then you go back to more careful translations for study. And this is what Mark is doing. I know you've heard it this way. I'm going to tell it to you differently, you know, so that you realize that you better wake up and pay attention to what's being said. And then Matthew, the genealogist, who's establishing Jesus' credentials and who brings more Old Testament texts than the other two, proof texts. You know, he's really somebody, our Greek Matthew is trying to point out how Jesus is really who the Hebrew Bible is talking about. Now, we have some necessary sophistications. Luke has doublets. He will, in the early part of his gospel, have a very Greek statement of Jesus. And later on in his gospel, he'll have an extended passage with the same statement, but in Hebraic Greek. And so here, in an article in the Jerusalem Perspective, you've got not just the Hebrew biography and a Greek translation, you've got a collection of Jesus' sayings, you've got an attempted reconstruction. Not going to go into this, but just to show you that, like I say, the world's greatest genius hasn't solved this and maybe won't, as we look at the variations. Here's another diagram of the power of the anthology, because then it explains this anthology, how we have such similarities between them, even though their own personalities are coming out in the different emphasis that we saw in the very beginnings of each one of the Gospels. Now, the symbols of the evangelists traditionally in the church come from those 4 symbols in Ezekiel, and now they make sense. Luke, the ox, the plodding ox who's faithfully bringing the materials that he's been researching, as he says. Mark, the devouring lion, drops out 8 chapters out of the middle of Luke and dramatizes, roars his way through, and immediately this and immediately that. And Matthew, the man, the steady man who's now picking up the pieces, and he's following Mark's dramatization and story order and his words, but he's putting back in some of the things that Mark has dropped and bringing more proof texts from the Old Testament. And we could add John, the eagle, the high-flying eagle, from this grand perspective of creation. In the beginning was the Word. Results. We see the early character of a Hebraic account of the Acts of Jesus, which fits perfectly into the situation of first century Judaism. It's not the creative invention of former pagan Greek speakers who are writing their thoughts several generations later. They could not have been able to generate the Jewish stories that we have in the New Testament, with all the reflection of passages out of the Hebrew Bible, as I love to call Jesus' Bible. Think about it. In the Gospels alone, it says Scripture or Scriptures 24 times. It says it is written 48 times. Then you got it is fulfilled. And all of those references are to Jesus' Bible. The New Testament, I love to say, is the authoritative commentary on Jesus' Bible. So authoritative that we do right to include it with the Scriptures. But you don't need the New Testament in order to get a scriptural testimony to Jesus. Paul didn't have it. Wasn't written yet. Jesus never quoted it. Wasn't written yet. He was the New Testament. 2, we see the importance of Hebraic thinking of Jesus' Bible. The Hebrew Bible, not Greek philosophy or customs, is the source of New Testament concepts. What's new about the New Testament? It's not God, it's the same God. It's not the people, it's the same people. It's not the concepts, it's all the same concepts of sin and salvation and a sacrifice. And so what's new? There's only one new command that Jesus gave: to love as I have loved you. God's love was never seen that clearly. That's the only one he says, I'm giving you a new commandment. So what was new? It happened. That was what was new. I would be a barbarian Norwegian Viking still worshiping Odin and Thor, the storm gods, if it weren't for the fact that it happens and it's too big to be kept for themselves. And so Peter finally gets it and goes to Cornelius and brings a Roman occupation officer and his family to the Lord. And Paul, of all people, becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. We find meaning by studying Hebrew. We learn to communicate meaning by studying Greek. Because after all, God in His providence has given us the text in Greek. That was the English of those days. That's for the sake of the outreach. It's too big to be kept just within the Jewish context. From the very beginning, Genesis chapter 12, I'm going to bless you so that you will be a blessing, so that all families of the earth in you will be blessed. 3, our spiritual roots are in biblical Judaism. Christians need to learn respect for our origins. Jews need to learn that a different kind of Christian is emerging from such respectful Bible study. And 4, we evangelical Christians are better equipped to undermine the doubts in the minds of all too many seminary students about the reliability of the gospel accounts. Parting shot. Simon Greenleaf, 18th century Christian lawyer, on the nature of true witness in court. If all the witnesses agree perfectly, I know they're lying. They sat down together and they cooked up the story. That's not how witness works. He said the ring of truth is if they've got the basics straight, but they were looking from this angle or that angle. And if one is giving us a genealogy and the other one is giving us a rapid account of the good news of Jesus' faithfulness to living out God's will among us, and another one is writing an orderly account, and another one is theologizing and philosophizing from the creation of the world, we should expect that it's going to be difficult, maybe even impossible, to fit them together. We're not dealing with myth, humanly invented stories. We're not dealing with magic. You know, the dictation theory that Muhammad heard a voice and then he just wrote it down. Or Joseph Smith went and dug up those plates and got some magic glasses that enabled him to read the plates that he dug up there in New Hampshire or wherever. We're dealing with miracle. We're dealing with God is able to speak through humans. And if God was able to use Luke the physician, Mark the youngster, Matthew the tax collector, and John the fisherman, He can use you and me. This is the encouragement, the comfort value, the pastoral relevance of the synoptic problem. Together, they are a strong manifold. 2 or 3 witnesses establish a matter. To the one gospel, the good news of Jesus' perfect faithfulness. Amen.